Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Towards the end of his essay on habit, or de la coutume, which has a secondary title, and on never easily changing a traditional law, Montaigne is going to approach that second topic, and he's going to stake out a position that we would say is rather conservative, also reflective of the history that he finds himself caught up in, and earlier history, because he brings up a lot of examples as well that can inform the France of his present time, a rather contentious place. And he's got this great formulation of this. He says, "It is greatly to be doubted whether any obvious good," in French, évident profit, can come from changing any traditional law. And traditional is reçu, meaning a law that is literally received, one that we've had in place for a while, whatever it may be, compared with the evil, the mal, of changing it. Now notice what he isn't saying here. He's not saying you must never, ever, ever change the laws because that will always be a bad thing. He's saying, listen, on the whole, it seems like it is in general a bad idea to start monkeying around with the laws, the structure of a society, the norms, you might say. And why is that the case? Well, he tells us that a polity or political community is like a building made of diverse pieces interlocked together, joined in such a way that it's impossible to move one without the whole structure feeling it. Now, he doesn't say the entire structure falling down, but, if you take out enough pieces, things begin to weaken. If you start undermining the norms that you have in place, making changes here and there, after a while it becomes very easy to make further changes and to bring the building itself down. And so, he says that there's a lot of cases of people in ancient times who, rightly understood that you should keep people from monkeying around. So he gives the example of the Thurians, the Spartans, and others like that. And then he says, "I abhor novelty no matter what visage it presents, and I'm right to do so." Why? Because I've seen some of its disastrous effects. So he's not saying, I am just a dyed in the wool, I don't want anything to change sort of conservative. He's saying, listen, I've seen what happens when we start changing things, and there's a lot of problems that arise when we start introducing novelties. He says that the novelty which has for so many years beset us is not solely responsible, but one can say with every likelihood that it has incidentally caused and given birth to them all. Even the evils and destruction which have subsequently happened without it, and despite it, it must accept responsibility. And so he brings up some interesting considerations. He says, those who shake the state are easily the first to be engulfed in its destruction, in its ruin, is another way of translating it. The fruits of dissension are not gathered by the one who began it. He stirs and troubles the waters for other men to fish in. And thinking further ahead in time, obviously much, much later, Robespierre furnishes an excellent example of this during the French Revolution. After sending so many to the guillotine, he has guillotined himself, right? And we could go on and on and on with other examples of this principle. Those who shake the state are going to participate in its ruin. That's not the only problem. And he brings up considerations which should move us not only to not shake the state, but also be suspicious of those who want to change things. So he says, once the great structure of the monarchy is shaken by novelty and its interwoven bonds torn asunder, the gates are opened as wide as you like to similar attacks. Now, does it have to be just a monarchy? I think that Montaigne would say this could apply to any sort of regime. Once you start calling things into question, you can call anything you like into question. And he says, if innovators do more harm, those who copy them are more at fault for rushing to follow examples after they've experienced the horror of them and punish them. And so he goes on and he says, from this first and abundant source, all kinds of new depravity can happen. So once the state, the social order has been altered, we can have all sorts of new innovations, and he's going to call them depravities. And depravities means ways of going wrong. He also says that we should be suspicious of those, and here he's drawing on Thucydides, right, the great Athenian historian of ancient times, of the Peloponnesian War. He says that people are going to flatter public vices and to justify them, giving them gentler names, rejecting true indictments of them as spurious or mitigating them. And they would say the intention is to reform our consciences and our beliefs. And Montaigne says, yeah, I'm calling BS on that. Why? Well, for one reason, self-love and arrogance, amour de soi, literally love of the self, and présomption, presumption is a cognate of that. Arrogance works well. Thinking you're better than other people, thinking you're smarter than other people, is typically what lies behind judging one's opinions so highly. Now, notice this. You could judge your opinions very highly, but keep them to yourself. Don't try to apply them to society. Don't say that we need to change these institutions, change these customs, change these laws, put new ones into place. It's going on to that, thinking that your opinions are so good that you're obliged to disturb the public peace in order to establish them. He says, that introduces unavoidable evils and horrifying moral corruption, which in matters of great importance, civil wars and political upheavals bring in their wake. And you may not be intending that at all. You may actually be saying, I need to be the one to prevent civil war. I have the plan, but you're probably going to bring about some sort of conflict as a result, he's saying. And he says that when the Roman Senate had differences with people about the service of religion, they would try to, pawn them off with evasions, right? And we get some interesting discussions about the Christian religion. And then he comes to say something really important. Here's a distinction that he wants to make. There is a huge gulf between the person who follows the conventions and laws of their country. Now notice he's not just saying the laws, but the customs, the norms, the ways of doing things. You can follow them, right? Or you can attempt or undertake, entreprendre in French, to regiment, régenter, or to changer those laws, because you think you know better than others. And he says that, you can sometimes go wrong by following the laws. He says, in excuse, the former can cite simplicity, obedience, and example. Whatever he may do, it cannot be from ill will, only from misfortune. So sometimes following the rules will, result in bad outcomes, granted. But the person who is deliberately trying to change things, he says, they're in a worse position. Anybody who undertakes to chop and change usurps the right to judge and must pride himself on seeing the defect in what he would get rid of and the good in what he would bring in. So they tend to develop a biased perspective that reinforces their own point of view. And Montaigne is actually going to say, I could have fallen into that myself when I was younger, a rasher youth, but I didn't do that sort of thing. And fortunate for me, right? So he's going to talk about why we shouldn't do this. He says we shouldn't submit public regulations and observances. Once again, we've got the legal, and we could call it the moral or ethical or customary. We shouldn't submit those to what he calls the instability of private ideas. And that is what everybody who wants to change things, inevitably, even if they're civically motivated, is going to be doing. Right? So he said, I didn't do that myself, thank goodness, because I could have done that, and other people shouldn't do that either. What about, because he is writing in a time when the Christian religion is being followed and at least, given lip service to, what about if you think that God has told you what to do? What if there's miracles and divine providence at work? Montaigne has a really great response to this. And he's writing in a time when civil wars are happening about religion. He says that, we are not required to follow these. What we're required to do is to contemplate them in ecstasy. So they don't really have to have any application to our society. They're really cool, but they're kind of in their own realm. And then he says, the Romans actually provide us with an example of this. He cites Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, where they've got this guy, Cotta, who is a Stoic, right? And so as a Stoic, the Stoics have some very definite views on the nature of the gods. And he says that in matters of religion, I do not follow Zeno, Cleanthes, or Chrysippus, the essentially founders of the Stoic school, but Titus Coruncanius, Publius Scipio, great hero, Publius Scaevola, and the supreme pontiffs, the high priests, you could say. So even that, he's not going to stick with his school, his philosophy. He's going to stick with his country. And that's, a model for Montaigne. The last thing that he's going to say that's particularly useful, I think, for understanding his point of view. And here he's kind of taking things back a bit. Nevertheless, fortune, so chance, right, the workings of things that are beyond our understanding, ever reserves her authority far above our arguments. She sometimes presents us with a need so pressing that the laws simply must find room for it. He says, if you're resisting the growth of an innovation which has recently been introduced by violence, it is a dangerous and unfair obligation to be restrained by rules everywhere and all the time in your struggle against those who run loose, for whom anything is licit which advances their cause, and for whom law and order means seeking their own advantage. So when you're dealing with opponents who are trying to change everything, right, according to whatever sort of ideas they happen to have, however persuasive they may be, you can take the gloves off. You can actually fight them on their own ground, he would say. He also brings up some interesting examples. So he says that we know two great figures in two civil wars, Octavius against Sylla and Cato against Caesar, are still reproached for having preferred to let their country suffer any extremity rather than come to its aid by changing anything whatever at the expense of the law. In truly in dire extremities, when it's impossible to hold on, it would perhaps be wiser to bow your head a little and let the blow fall rather than to cling impossibly on. So he's saying Cato is actually not providing us with a great example here. We should be leery of this. We don't want to undermine the laws altogether and say, well, situation of emergency, but we also should, find ways to make them more flexible. So, he says the Spartans observed the ordinances of their country when they were caught between a law forbidding them to elect the same admiral twice and a pressing emergency requiring Lysander to reassume that office. Even they elected someone as an admiral and then appointed Lysander superintendent of the Navy. So they found a way around it, right? And we get another great example. A Spartan ambassador who was dispatched to the Athenians to negotiate a change in one of their laws found Pericles testifying it was forbidden to remove a tablet once a law had been inscribed on it. But, Pericles said, this is not forbidden to turn a tablet around so nobody can see that particular law. So he's counseling a certain kind of flexibility, which still reflects we could say, honoring of the laws in general, just saying, well, in this case, we're not going to apply that. So Montaigne is making a pretty strong argument here against any sort of rationalistic attempt to reformulate the laws and make them better, because it gives rise to instability and too many openings for people who are inflated by self-love and arrogance and the desire to see their side win, to start making things for their own advantage, which just adds to the undermining of the system in place, which ordinary people need in order to do well in that very society. So he's providing what looks like a very conservative argument with a couple important loopholes or provisos, but he's giving you a justification for it that I think many of us could find quite compelling.